Being surrounded by endless water should be a sailor's salvation. But for ancient crews, it was a death sentence. Seawater doesn't quench, it kills. One mouthful sets off a chain reaction inside your body. Your cells shrivel, your kidneys shut down, and within hours you're worse off than before. That's why the ocean became history's cruelest joke. Billions of gallons you couldn't drink, even as thirst clawed at your throat. So what did sailors do when the barrels ran dry and land was nowhere in sight? They fought back. They caught rain in storm sails, pulled fresh water from the very air, and even found ways to make the ocean surrender its salt. Long before anyone understood chemistry, physics, or osmosis, desperate sailors were running experiments at sea, tests written in sweat, salt, and blood. Some methods failed horribly. Others kept entire crews alive and reshaped what was possible on the open ocean. This is the story of how ancient sailors turned seawater, the ocean's deadliest poison, into the one thing they needed most: drinking water. Seawater will kill you with mathematical precision. Not slowly, not gently. It'll rip the life out of you faster than you can say just one gulp. The salt concentration in seawater sits at roughly 4 times that of human blood, creating an osmotic nightmare that ancient sailors learned to fear more than storms, pirates, or sea monsters combined. Here's the death spiral. You drink seawater because you're desperately thirsty. That salt floods your bloodstream, making it dangerously concentrated. Your cells, trying to balance things out, dump their precious water into your blood to dilute the salt. But your kidneys, they need even more water to process and excrete all that sodium than you just consumed. So you end up with a net loss of water, becoming more dehydrated than when you started. The progression is swift and merciless. Within hours, you're experiencing intense thirst that makes your original desperation seem quaint. Your mouth turns to leather, your tongue swells, and your brain starts misfiring. Hallucinations kick in. Sailors reported seeing freshwater springs on the horizon, phantom islands, dead crewmates offering drinks. Then comes the vomiting, violent and unstoppable, expelling what little fluid remains in your system. Your heart starts racing as your blood volume drops, desperately trying to maintain circulation to vital organs. Blood vessels constrict, turning your extremities cold and blue. Your kidneys begin shutting down, toxins building up in your blood like poison. Within days, organ failure cascades through your body. Brain, liver, heart, everything starts dying at once. Historical records from life raft voyages paint the picture in stark numbers. 39% death rate for those who drank seawater versus 3% for those who resisted the temptation. Ancient sailors figured this out the hard way, watching crewmates die screaming for more of the very liquid that was killing them. They learned that the ocean's greatest cruelty came from offering infinite water you couldn't drink. Every voyage was a calculated gamble with death, and water was the currency. Ancient ship captains had to solve a brutal equation. How much water, how many men, how far to the next port, and how much cargo space they could sacrifice to maybe stay alive. The standard allocation sounds generous until you do the math. Contemporary accounts suggest 126 gallons per sailor for long voyages, roughly half a gallon per day per man. That might keep you alive, but barely. Compare that to modern survival recommendations of a gallon per day in normal conditions, and you realize ancient sailors were already operating in permanent mild dehydration even when things went according to plan. Ships carried water in massive wooden casks, some holding hundreds of gallons, stored deep in the hull where they wouldn't shift during storms. These containers served as complex engineering solutions. The wood had to be properly seasoned and sealed, often with tar or pitch, to prevent both leakage and contamination. A single crack in a water cask could doom an entire crew. The hierarchy of containers tells the story of desperate conservation. Large storage casks fed into smaller working barrels of 6 to 10 gallons, designed for ease of carrying around the ship. Individual sailors might have personal containers holding a day's ration, carefully measured and jealously guarded. Every drop was accounted for, every container inspected daily. Water theft was treated as attempted murder of the entire crew. Captains ordered sailors whipped and pickled, flogged until their backs were raw, then had salt rubbed into the wounds. The punishment fit the crime. Salt in wounds for stealing the means to dilute salt from blood. Some captains simply threw water thieves overboard, reasoning that they'd already demonstrated they couldn't be trusted with the crew's survival. Navigation errors turned careful planning into death sentences. A storm that pushed you off course, contrary winds that delayed arrival, or simply miscalculating distance to the next port could transform a routine voyage into a desperate scramble for survival. When the water ran low, every decision became life or death. Greek sailors stumbled onto one of the most elegant solutions by accident, discovering principles of atmospheric physics that wouldn't be formally understood for over 1,000 years. They hung sheep pelts from the sides of their ships during night voyages, and morning would bring them dripping with fresh water condensed from the air. The physics behind this accidental genius is beautiful in its simplicity. As ships moved through cool night air, the temperature difference between the warm, humid air near the ocean's surface and the cold wool created perfect condensation conditions. Water vapor in the air would condense on the fibers, exactly like dew forming on grass, but concentrated and collectible. The Greeks didn't understand they were performing atmospheric water generation. They just knew that sometimes the wool got wet with water that didn't taste like death. The wool needed to be the right type, coarse, fibrous, with maximum surface area for condensation. Sheep pelts worked perfectly because the natural lanolin in wool actually helped collect and channel water droplets. The process required patience and specific conditions. Clear, cool nights with high humidity worked best. Too much wind would blow the condensed water away before it could be collected. Too little humidity meant no condensation. Sailors learned to read weather patterns, not just for sailing, but for water harvesting. They became atmospheric scientists out of desperation. Morning collection was its own ritual. Sailors would carefully wring out the pelts, capturing every drop in containers. The water tasted of wool and lanolin. Accounts describe it as wool-flavored. But it was fresh, life-saving liquid that could mean the difference between survival and death. A single pelt might yield a few cups of water on a good night. Hardly luxurious, but enough to keep a sailor alive another day. Aristotle himself documented the principle behind this technique, noting that salt water evaporated forms fresh, and the vapor does not, when it condense into seawater again. He understood that evaporation separated salt from water, leaving pure liquid behind. Ancient sailors were practicing distillation science without knowing it, using the atmosphere as their laboratory. When the skies opened, ancient ships transformed into desperate water collection systems. Catching rainwater at sea required understanding weather, chemistry, and engineering that most land dwellers never developed. The first challenge was salt contamination. Ocean spray constantly coats everything on a ship with salt crystals, meaning the first minutes of any rainfall would wash deadly sodium into your collection system. Experienced sailors learned to let the initial rain wash away this salt residue before directing water into storage. Those precious first minutes of fresh water were sacrificed to prevent contaminating the entire supply with salt that could kill you. Sails became massive collection surfaces, but they required careful preparation. Different materials absorbed water differently. Linen sails worked better than wool for collection because they shed water more efficiently once saturated. The weave of the cloth mattered too. Too tight, and water would sheet off without being captured. Too loose, and it would absorb the water instead of channeling it. Ships developed sophisticated drainage systems, using the natural slope of decks and carefully positioned channels to funnel rainwater toward collection points. Canvas tarps could be rigged as temporary funnels, creating improvised watersheds that captured rain from large areas. Every square foot of ship surface became potential water collection space when lives depended on it. Storage during collection presented its own challenges. You couldn't just dump rainwater into existing water supplies without risking contamination of your entire reserve. Fresh rainwater went into clean, dedicated containers first, to be tested and verified before mixing with precious stores. A single mistake could turn your entire water supply brackish and dangerous. The timing was everything. Rain squalls at sea are often brief and intense, meaning crews had minutes to deploy collection systems and capture what they could. Missing a rain opportunity because you weren't prepared could doom the entire voyage. Sailors developed an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns, sensing approaching rain hours before it arrived and preparing their collection systems accordingly. Rain was unreliable though, depending on weather patterns, could leave you becalmed under clear skies while your crew died of thirst. Smart captains treated rainwater as a bonus, not a strategy. The real test came when the skies stayed blue and the water barrels ran dry. When desperation reached its peak, ancient sailors turned to the sea's living creatures for the water their bodies hoarded. Fish became walking water bottles, and sailors learned to extract every drop through techniques that bordered on surgical precision. Ocean fish are roughly 80% water, making them floating reservoirs in a liquid desert. Accessing that water required knowledge that sailors acquired through trial and deadly error. Different parts of fish contained different concentrations of water and salt. The eyes held relatively pure fluid. Sailors would carefully extract the aqueous humor, the clear liquid that fills the eyeball, providing small but crucial amounts of fresh water. Spinal fluid offered another source. Cutting a fish precisely along the spine exposed cerebrospinal fluid that contained less salt than the surrounding flesh. Sailors learned to make surgical cuts, accessing these hidden water reserves that could provide a few precious sips of relatively fresh liquid. The techniques required practice and knowledge passed down through generations of desperate men. Fish flesh itself presented a more complex challenge. The meat contained significant water alongside proteins that required water to metabolize. Eating large amounts of fish without adequate fresh water could actually accelerate dehydration through the metabolic burden of processing all that protein. Sailors had to balance the water gained from fish against the water needed to digest it. The salt content varied dramatically between different fish and different parts of the same fish. Flesh near the skin contained more salt from constant contact with seawater. Internal organs could be relatively fresh, but also carried risks of parasites and contamination. Sailors developed rules of thumb about which fish, which parts, and how much they could safely consume when water was scarce. Some sailors tried pressing fish flesh to extract pure liquid, creating primitive juicing techniques that separated water from protein and salt. Others learned to cook fish in ways that concentrated the liquid, reducing it to its essential water content while removing some of the salt through evaporation. Birds offered similar opportunities. Seabirds that land on ships carry fresh water in their systems, and desperate sailors learned to extract it. Birds also presented the risk of being needed for navigation. Some species could indicate nearby land, making them more valuable alive than as water sources. The psychological cost of these techniques was enormous. Sailors found themselves performing increasingly desperate acts, extracting life from creatures to preserve their own. When the alternative was death by dehydration, moral qualms became luxuries they couldn't afford. Ancient sailors discovered that staying alive at sea meant revolutionizing what counted as water. Beer became their primary hydration strategy, a liquid that provided calories, vitamins, and life-sustaining fluid while simultaneously protecting them from the microbes that turned regular water lethal. Sailors consumed roughly a gallon of beer per day, making them functional alcoholics by modern standards. This was survival science, not recreational drinking. The alcohol content was lower than modern beer, often diluted with water, providing hydration without the devastating effects of full-strength spirits. Beer offered carbohydrates that kept sailors functional during the brutal physical demands of shipboard life. The fermentation process that created beer also created a sterile environment, hostile to the bacteria and parasites that thrived in stored water. Sailors didn't understand microbiology, but they understood that water went bad while beer stayed safe. The alcohol acted as a preservative, killing pathogens that would otherwise cause dysentery, cholera, and other diseases that could kill a crew faster than dehydration. When available, sailors used silver coins or silver vessels to store their drinking liquids. Silver has natural antimicrobial properties that ancient sailors discovered through observation and trial. Water stored in silver containers stayed fresh longer, and silver coins dropped into storage vessels helped prevent contamination. They called it magic while practicing materials science. Different cultures developed different solutions to the liquid problem. Wine served similar functions in Mediterranean sailing cultures, providing hydration and preservation. Some ships carried distilled spirits that could be diluted with available water, using high alcohol content as a sterilizing agent for questionable water sources. When beer supplies ran low, sailors faced the same desperate mathematics as with water. Rationing beer meant rationing calories, hydration, and protection from disease simultaneously. The hierarchy of desperation meant that beer was often the last safe liquid before crews started considering the fatal option of seawater. Every voyage became a life-or-death experiment in human survival, and the ocean served as the most unforgiving laboratory in human history. Ancient sailors unknowingly developed scientific methods that wouldn't be formally recognized for centuries, using trial and error where failure meant death. Each technique represented accumulated knowledge bought with lives. The sailors who discovered that sheep pelts could collect water vapor probably lost crewmates to dehydration before figuring it out. The navigators who learned to read weather patterns for rain collection did so because previous crews died waiting for water that never came. Every successful method had a foundation of failure and death. Ships became floating laboratories for survival science. Crews tested different materials for water collection, experimented with storage methods, and developed preservation techniques through desperate necessity. They couldn't afford controlled studies or peer review. If a method failed, people died. If it worked, the knowledge passed to the next voyage, the next crew, the next generation of desperate men. The cross-cultural exchange of survival knowledge happened through the brutal marketplace of life and death. When ships from different civilizations encountered each other, they shared techniques not out of academic curiosity, but because each method could save lives. Greek condensation techniques spread to Roman ships. Egyptian purification methods influenced Phoenician voyages. The stakes were too high for cultural pride or trade secrets. Ancient sailors developed understanding of chemistry, physics, and biology that exceeded what most scholars of their time possessed. They knew which materials condensed water most efficiently, how to read atmospheric conditions for weather prediction, and which biological sources provided the best risk to benefit ratios for emergency hydration. This knowledge came from watching crewmates live or die based on their decisions, not from books or theories. The margin for error was microscopic. A single mistake in water calculation could doom an entire expedition. Miscalculating consumption rates, underestimating voyage duration, or failing to account for weather delays could transform a routine trading mission into a desperate fight for survival. Every decision required balancing known risks against unknown variables, with death as the penalty for error. Modern survival manuals often reference techniques that ancient sailors developed through necessity. Atmospheric water generation, biological water extraction, and liquid preservation methods that seem advanced today were daily realities for crews who couldn't afford to get them wrong. They became experts in survival science because failure to achieve expertise meant death. The psychological toll of this constant experimentation shaped maritime culture for centuries. Sailors developed superstitions around water collection, rituals around consumption, and hierarchies around access to fresh liquid. These were psychological coping mechanisms for people who lived daily with the knowledge that their next drink might be their last. Ancient sailors never set out to rewrite science. They just wanted to live long enough to see land again. But in battling the ocean's cruelest puzzle, how to drink water while drowning in it, they stumbled onto discoveries that would echo across history. Chemistry, physics, biology. They learned it the hardest way possible, through trial and error, where error meant burying your shipmates at sea. Every glass of water you drink today carries their legacy. Every faucet, every filtered bottle, every drop of clean hydration is built on knowledge purchased with desperation, courage, and loss. They turned the ocean's deadliest poison into a teacher, and the classroom was their ship, adrift, starving, and surrounded by blue infinity. So the next time you're near a pool you can't sip from, or stare at a river made toxic by industry, remember you're looking at the same riddle that mocked ancient sailors. The difference is that you already hold the answer. They had to invent it, out there on the waves, with nothing but wood, cloth, fire, and willpower. And against all odds, they solved it. They cracked the code of survival, and in doing so, they saved us all.